If you just let your imagination wander, you're not going to produce really, really good results. But if you force yourself to work and think within a framework, your output will be so much better because that's where your imagination works. Another thing I tell people is, you have 7 different key messages, but inside those 7 key messages, there's like 4,000 different combinations of the key messages.
Help us understand, what is StoryBrand?
Essentially what StoryBrand is it's a messaging framework developed by a man named Donald Miller. It's a 7-part messaging framework that...
In today's episode, we're joined by Cameron Olds. Cameron is the co-founder and president of Protagonist Communications, where he leverages his expertise in messaging as a StoryBrand certified guide to help organizations communicate clearly and uniquely. Cameron helps the founders and operators of multi-billion-dollar organizations avoid sounding the same as the competition and ensures their message is consistent across all their communication channels. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Digital Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Eli Adams. Today's episode is brought to you by FireUsMarketing.com, where SEO solutions pave the way to digital excellence. Welcome to the show, Cameron.
It's great to be here, Eli.
Yeah, man, I'm real excited to have you here. I know that, I see all of your posts on LinkedIn, and I love what you're doing on LinkedIn. I love that you're helping all these companies do it. And I took advantage of that and had you do an analysis of Fire Us Marketing, and you gave some amazing insights. And I think it's very appropriate to have you on the show at this time where, with the Digital Revolution podcast, we talk about the end user experience, right? And I think it's very important to talk about brand messaging in that, because I think what a lot of companies don't understand is, you hear a lot about like know your audience, and which a lot of people think is like, are they male? Are they female? Are they between this age or that age? And everyone kind of gets that, right? But really understanding the psychology of like how to get to those people, I think, is what's missing. So I'm real excited to dive in and learn from you today. But before we dive into some of that tactical stuff, let's get to know Cameron a little bit. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? What'd you want to be when you were little? And how did you go from that to where you're at now?
Yeah, great question. So I'm Utah born and raised, Utah bred. Grew up in a tiny town called American Fork, if anyone knows it. Went to college at Utah State University, studied public relations and corporate communication and all that stuff.
Nice.
But like, honestly, like I wanted to be a Hollywood director for a long time. Like movies were my jam. Like in high school, I competed in several 48-hour film festivals. For those that don't know what that is, essentially what they do is they give you a prompt for a movie script or whatever. They're like, you have to include these props, and some characters have to say these lines, and you have to maybe do these locations or whatever, and they'll kind of give you like a mixed bag of weird stuff, and you have to make a movie of it in 48 hours in 2 days. So I did a lot of that. My films won first place in a lot of different competitions. I went on and competed nationally, took 8th in the nation, and in college, I spent some time in Hollywood. So like I was on that track real hard. I was like, I was going to do it. But then, you asked like, how did I go from there to here? And I'm like, I don't even know if I know myself. Like, I think I found, because the one thing that I loved about filmmaking and directing and writing and all that stuff was kind of the structure of the story. How do you structure it in such a way that, by the end of the film, you elicit X reaction or X response, and you have these cool moments. Like, how do you structure that? How do you organize those things so that you get good results or whatever? And that was always what fascinated me. So I'm like what you would have called like a narrative structuralist. No, they call them structuralists. Like in Hollywood, it's these guys that like, they love 3-act structure, they love 5-act structure, and they write it, and everything's organized accordingly. You have a camp that's not that way. They're just kind of like loosey goosey, whatever flows on the page is what goes. But I was very much a structuralist because I was very fascinated by how do you like methodically organize a story so that it's actually like interesting and effective and all that stuff. And I think what happened was in college, I kind of found that in public relations and marketing. I found that it was kind of a similar application. And, I spent time in Hollywood, and I was like, oh, I don't, this isn't really conducive to the lifestyle I want, and it's long hours. And so I think all of those things together of me realizing that Hollywood wasn't where I wanted to be. And I also found I could do a lot of what I enjoyed and what fascinated me in this marketing communications side of things, that I think I just naturally kind of transitioned into that. And
Was there anything as a kid that sort of um, made you think this way? Was it like you'd be watching movies and you tried to like predict the movie, and like, can you tie anything from like your childhood to StoryBrand?
yeah, I grew up on Star Wars. I grew up on the Richard Donner Superman. So I was always watching these movies, and there were always, these big moments in these movies. I think the one that comes to my mind right now is in the Richard Donner Superman film, where
Mhm.
he like comes out as Superman for the first time, and he saves Lois, and he like grabs the helicopter and takes it back to the roof and all that. I remember watching that, and I was always just like enthralled by that. I was like, how did they do that? Like, the music was perfect, it felt heroic, and you're like cheering,
Yeah,
and I always just had a smile on my face. And as I grew up, I was like, how do they do that? Like, how did I get to the point where I, felt that way? And so I
yeah,
was kind of in the same way. I feel like kids who are really fascinated by mechanics, and they're trying to figure out how an engine works, so they take apart the engine.
hmm,
I got to the point where I was trying to take apart a movie and look at it from its component parts of like, okay,
hmm,
so this character did this and they set this up, and then it paid off later.
yeah,
And that eventually got me into reading screenplays, and so I could see from a blueprint of a movie, like all of the different ways you set up a moment, and
hmm,
all of the different ways you can structure a film, and what are some of the archetypical or archetypal structures and characters and stuff like that. And what was cool is, like, as I studied it, I learned that, there are you can be like really intentional about it, about creating these moments, because there is a structure, and there is like time tested ways that you can, orchestrate these moments. And so for me, one of the early moments was, watching Superman.
Now, because you're so into film, does it ruin movies for you now? Because I know, like, I have, some family members that went to, had some film classes, not even like as deep as you, but like had film classes, and they go to some movies, and I think like the story is just dumb, but they're like, oh, it was perfect because it had this structure and did that at this moment, and I'm like, that was dumb. And then I watch another one that's just like a silly, like Dumb and Dumber type show. And I'm like, it was the best. And they're like, oh, Rotten Tomatoes had it at like a 1.9. So, like, don't watch it. Do you find yourself falling into that camp where you love some because of that when other people don't, because it's just not like as enjoyable, I guess?
Yeah, like, for as much as I loved like dissecting movies, I was always aware that there was that crowd that was just like, would look at you like down past their nose if you didn't
Yeah.
like it a certain way, or you were.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I never wanted to be that. Like, I
Mm,
really was interested in how it worked, but I didn't want to do that. So I've always tried to like appreciate all movies. But to your point, like, I felt like, because I I kind of understood how, how the engine was running under the hood, I could
mm-hmm.
appreciate it a little more when someone stuck the landing, just because I knew how hard it was to put a movie together and execute a moment like that. So like, I felt like, if anything, I still had like, and this, I don't mean it like this pretentious, but like, the tastes of the everyday man, of like, oh, I could go to a movie and enjoy it and not think anything of
Yeah.
it. But then I also had this appreciation, like, because I knew structurally what was going on. I could really appreciate a moment that landed really well, because I was like, oh shoot, I know I did that, and that's really hard to do.
Yeah. So, what's the best movie over the last decade that stuck the landing?
Stuck the landing. I think Dune Part Two did that just recently.
Okay.
I like nearly flawless to me. I like borderline perfect. In my book, I think that um, the building, and then the breaking of Paul and Chani, and because there's so much that goes into it. Like, because like, as a director, you're worried about like the script, and like,
Yeah.
and capturing what's on the script, and making sure that those moments are important. But then you're also dealing with like makeup, and production design, and camera, and what's it going to look like, and what do the
Yeah.
costumes look like. So there's so many different things that you have to be aware of, and orchestrate as a director. And it's it's really really hard to get all of those things like working together in concert and execute really really well. And
Mhm.
I think he, Denis Villeneuve is the director and the writer, and I think he did a superhuman effort, like Herculean effort, to do it as
Yeah.
well as he did.
So see, that to me is one that like I enjoyed watching it, and I was like, oh, that's a good show. But the way like other people are like, oh, it's the best thing I've ever seen. Like to me, um, the last two Avengers, like Infinity War,
Mm,
like
also
those to me,
good.
like those brought tears to my eyes. Like I was
Yeah.
cheering, I was like, yeah, like. But like Dune was like a good show. But
Right.
like I'll watch most Marvel shows once a year at least, if not more, right? Dune, I'll watch every once in a while. But like it's just kind of the entertainment value, I guess, like a little bit more nostalgia. I had never been into Dune growing up, like a lot of
Right.
people had either too. So it could be that as well.
Fun. Like I totally agree with Infinity War and Endgame. I think what they did was crazy. I
Mm-hmm.
watched because I was fascinated with how they put that together. So I dug a lot to figure out like what were the screenwriters doing and all this, and I found a cool interview with the two writers, and structurally just to kind of like on the Avengers side, like structurally, what happens with Cap and Tony in Endgame is it's really interesting because essentially they're opposite characters, and
Yeah.
what they figured out was, at the end Tony had to give up his life that he had tried so hard to keep, but
Yeah.
Cap was the opposite, and he needed to get a life. Like he needed to like
Mm-hmm.
stop caring so much, and so they realized halfway through writing that they were on um, opposite arcs. And so when they figured that out, they were all like, "Oh, that's a great day's work. Everyone go get a drink tonight because that was good."
Yeah.
So like you can see them like over the course of the movie, like you can see them building to where Cap's going this way and Tony's going the other way, and then it all Cap. Is it still spoiler? It's like 10 years later, whatever.
No, it's
Cap
not. It's not. Yeah.
Cap stays in the past. Cap is selfish. Cap stays and gets takes something for himself for once, but then Tony obviously makes the ultimate sacrifice plan and loses his life. So when you look
Yeah.
at it structurally, when I looked at it structurally at Endgame, I was like, "Oh, that's freaking brilliant." They did that really, really well.
Yeah. Well, not just those two shows, but I'm actually in the middle of rewatching all the Marvel from the beginning again. And I do this about once a year. I'll start at Captain America and I'll go through every single one of them, including all the TV shows. So sometimes it takes me a whole
Wow.
year to get through all of it. And it's usually just like going to bed at night, I'll put on for 20 or 30 minutes or whatever. But to watch from the beginning, and even my wife pointed this out the other night we were watching, and who was it? It was somebody in the first Iron Man. They brought up that the terrorists were named the Ten Rings,
Oh yeah.
and so it ties into this other one. But I mean, the Ten Rings was 18 years away from when that was created, and so they tie all these in together. It's the whole entire franchise is pretty phenomenal to me. So I just love that.
Kevin Feige. I mean, hats off to that guy. Dude's made like the Puppet Master Supreme. Just
Yeah.
maps it all out. I mean, I don't know how he does it. It's insane. Um, Actually, I do know how he does it. They call it so. This might be tangential. Let me know if it is. But like,
All good.
so they do normally what you do at like a studio like Warner Brothers or something like that is you just kind of have producers or screenwriters that will come in and they'll pitch ideas or whatever.
Hmm.
And it's kind of a one man show. Everything's kind of in silo.
Hmm.
But with Marvel Studios, they actually put together what they call the Marvel Parliament,
Mm.
and it's a group of producers that all together are kind of mapping out, oh, I'm going to take this project because I think this is interesting and I think it might dovetail nicely with that project you're doing. And so it's kind of like this congress of producers and writers that are all working together to pave the way for this crazy interconnected narrative that they're threading. So it's kind of cool. It's
Yeah.
called the Marvel Parliament. If anyone cared to know that, I thought that was really interesting.
That is cool. That is very cool. They do a good job at it. I know that they've lacked a little bit over the last year, couple years, but I think they're coming back, and I still enjoy it either way. Even if it's silly, I'll still watch it. Cameron, what are you currently working on that excites you? Like you get up in the morning, you're like, man, I can't wait to do this. What's that?
There are a couple different things that I'm working on at the moment that are kind of fun. One is actually A book I'm writing.
Nice.
Yeah, has nothing to do with Protagonist, but it's something that like at the end of the day,
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, like this is a nice way to relax and just kind of think about a book I'm writing. So it's on like the virtue of moderation, temperance, and self mastery, and all that stuff.
Like balancing, is that what you're talking about? Like don't have too much of this and balance that. And
In like the political sense, it's like discouraging like ideological purity, saying that like reason and wisdom doesn't exist exclusively at like one point of the political spectrum. Like
Mhm.
there's a lot of different ways to solve a problem, and because there's a lot of different ways, and everyone has different opinions and different life experiences and upbringings
Yeah.
and situations that define how they think, like the best way through is kind of seeing, okay, like what are the best ways that everyone can contribute and bring together, and find the way through, instead of just saying that like, oh, like I have everything, I know everything, and I have the solutions to everything, and they have no solutions. So like this, like ideological purity on either side isn't really
Yeah.
productive. So that's kind of what I'm studying right now and researching is, who are some examples of people that have reached across the aisle and compromised and done the hard work of navigating, different
Yeah.
ideas and consolidating and synthesizing and bringing people together, because I think that's super. I really admire that when I see that in like a leader, regardless of like
Mhm.
political whatever, even in business, someone who can kind of sit in the middle of two ideas and
Mhm.
bring people together and say, okay, cool, like this is really good idea, and I think this is also a good idea. Can we bring them together some way and execute on it? I think that's a wonderful trait.
That's cool. I think it's needed both in the leadership area as well as the political spectrum. I think
Yeah,
the younger generations growing up aren't so much left or right. They're more kind of in the middle. They look at both sides, and
yeah,
sadly, our current situation politically is tearing people apart more than it should be
mhm,
bringing them together. But I
yeah,
think, like you said, just in business too, it like you and I can look at the leaders we've had in the past, and Austin is one that is
yeah,
so good at that. We've both worked with Austin, and he is so good at like looking at all sides. And either usually it's not him saying, hey, here's what we're going to do. It's usually him leading through it and having the team come up with the best idea. So I think that's phenomenally right in that book. I'm excited for it to come out.
I'm excited too.
Okay, so if we were to dive into the tactical side of things, so the audience here is, either business owners or up and coming digital marketers who are listening to the podcast to try to get a different perspective, a different take on how they can elevate their business online or the business they work for online. So maybe we start at just like a high level. Help us understand what is StoryBrand.
Yeah. I think that's great because it kind of ties in that whole movie conversation. We started that. I was like, I know where it's going, but if people
Yeah.
hang on, we'll get
Yep.
to it a little bit.
Yeah.
So StoryBrand, this was kind of one of the things that I discovered in college that kind of encouraged that transition for me from, oh, let's do Hollywood to let's take a look at this. And essentially what StoryBrand is it's a framework, it's a messaging framework developed by a man named Donald Miller, who's a phenomenal marketing mind. He fantastic mentor to me, and his stuff is really great. In fact, StoryBrand started as a book, so you can go buy it. It's called Building a Story Brand. If you want to, if you listen to this today and you're like, oh, I want to learn more, there's a whole book on it. It's called Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller. That'll be like your textbook, your Bible for the next little bit if you want to dive more. So that's a great resource for anyone that wants to know more after.
Okay.
But essentially, what it is it's a 7-part messaging framework that um, brings together and synthesizes the best storytelling practices of the last like 2,000 years, since Aristotle's Poetics. Aristotle
Yeah.
in ancient Greece, like, is kind of the one we attribute to actually writing down like, this is what a good story is. It starts with this, a character, and it has a problem and all this stuff, and essentially like the hero's journey is what I think most people are probably familiar with it, the hero's journey.
Yeah.
And so StoryBrand, it takes all of these principles, these best practices, and it organizes them into 7 different principles for you and applies it to your marketing and brand storytelling. So essentially what you're doing is you're taking all of the tactics and knowledge and all that make like the MCU really, really great, or that make Star Wars really, really great. And you're applying that to your brand, your company, your product. You're talking about your product in 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 a story, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can go through those 7 different key messages real fast, and then let me just introduce that, and then we can kind of get into like some tactical stuff of what you can do probably relatively quickly to implement some of these ideas in your marketing.
Okay.
But the first point is, you have to identify who the hero is. Who's the hero of your story? Who's the main character? This is in marketing terms and in business terms, like this is your target audience. This is who you're communicating with. This is who you're trying to get to buy your product. So you have to identify, who is you're talking to? What do they want? It's not until you have a main character that wants something that the story actually kind of starts to take shape and get momentum. Like in Lord of the Rings, Frodo wants to save the Shire. In Star Wars, Luke wants to become a Jedi. Luke wants to leave this farmer life on Tatooine. He wants to make something of himself. So you have to. So from a marketing perspective, you have to kind of walk yourself through that. Who am I talking to? What is it that they want? Who do they aspire to be? Who do they want to be like? And then the second key message is, you have a problem. What's the problem that stands in the way of them getting what they want? Um, so that could be a lot of different things depending on your product and stuff. But identifying what's the core problem, what do they struggle with, what keeps them up at night, what makes them anxious, all that stuff. So hero with the desire has a problem, that they can't solve on their own. And the third key message, or the third principle, is you have to introduce another character in the story called a guide. And the guide is essentially, it's Obi-Wan, or it's Yoda, or it's Gandalf, or it's Haymitch in Hunger Games, or it's Stilgar in Dune. Like you can see, like these characters like exist in these stories, but the guide is essentially, the wise mentor that says, "Oh, I see you have a problem. I had that problem once upon a time. I know how to solve that problem. I can help you get out of the situation. I can help you get what you want." So this guide character essentially becomes the mentor that helps the hero solve the problem. And in the marketing application, the guide is essentially you, the business owner, the product, the brand. You play the guide. You are the one that comes in and says, "I see you have a problem. I know where you want to go. My product, my service, whatever, my expertise can help you get there. I can help you solve this problem. If you do X, Y, Z." And so the guide, going to the fourth key message, or the fourth principle, is gives them a plan. In order to solve your problem, you're going to have to do X, Y, Z. You're going to have to you have to take the ring to Rivendell, and then you'll have to take the ring to Mount Doom, and then you'll have to throw it into the Mount Doom. Like, give them a plan. Just break down big tasks, break down big quests into bite-sized pieces. And then the fifth one is call them to action. In The Hobbit, Gandalf literally has to kick Bilbo out of his door. Same thing with marketers. Everyone knows this. This is kind of like everyone knows you have to have a call to action. So that's pretty self-explanatory. But then the last two key messages, the last two principles, are collectively known as the stakes. The positive stakes and the negative stakes. What happens if you don't solve the problem? How does your life continue to be uncomfortable, and what do you have to lose? And then on the flip side, like, what do you have to win? Like, what do you stand to gain if you do solve the problem? Keeping with the Lord of the Rings example, like the stakes is, well, if we don't destroy the ring, then Sauron wins, and the free peoples of Middle Earth are enslaved, and it's no fun for everyone. But if we win, then like Sauron's defeated, and we can have peace and all this stuff. So there has to be stakes at the end. So that's the StoryBrand framework, and you can learn a lot more about that in the book. by Donald Miller if you want to really dive into it. But essentially, it's a hero with a problem, meets a guide who gives him a plan, calls him to action that avoids failure and ends in success. Those are seven key principles there. And in terms of what are some quick tactical things you could do to implement that into your marketing and storytelling? The first one is, I would say, is try to, if you don't already, try to really understand what it is the problem that you solve. What's the problem that you solve? What are your customers dealing with specifically? Another book or an idea that really pairs nicely with this is, the Jobs to Be Done framework by, I think it was Clayton Christensen, the Innovator's Dilemma and all that stuff. What job are they hiring you to do? What problem are you solving? Really become intimately familiar with that. Ask customers, conduct interviews. You can mine reviews of your product and service, like on Google or on Amazon or stuff like that. Look for how they're describing the problem and how they feel about the problem, because that'll tell you a lot about, what they're looking for. Because problems are hooks, right? Like, people only pay attention to you because you're hopefully solving a problem for them. And if you're not solving a problem for them, or if they don't perceive you to be solving a problem, then they really won't pay attention to you. So I'd say one thing you can do probably today is start trying to understand those problems. Be specific, and if you can, use your customers' words, adopt your own customers' words. What's the voice of the customer? How do they describe the problem? How do they describe when they're upset or something like that? If you can incorporate that language into your own marketing, that does really, really well. That makes for great copy. And then one more off the top of my head, I might be rambling, but one more might be, in addition to that, knowing what the problem is you solve, but then also try to understand how your product solves that problem uniquely. How are you unique from the competition? Do you help influencers land jobs in a better way? Do you do something different than other influencer agencies? Is your product formulated in a unique, patented way, or are you? Do you have a unique process that's manufacturing process? Is your supply chain? Like, just start looking at how are you unique? How are you different from the competition? And when you start talking about yourself as the guide, let that come to the forefront. Show them that I'm different from all the other options you have out there, and it's good for you that I'm different because of X, Y, Z. So understand the problem you solve, but then also understand how you are unique in solving that problem for your customers. Those two things, that's a pretty lethal 1-2 punch combo if you can get that right.
So I know a lot of people are going to listen to this, and they're going to probably have to rewatch everything you just said over the last 10 minutes over and over.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Like, it was a lot of really good information. The 7 steps, and attributing it to movies really helps, I think, as well. But once people start getting into it, I know that sometimes it can be a little bit challenging. So, like, when you work with companies, what are the biggest challenges businesses face when trying to create an authentic brand message, and how do you help them overcome that?
Yeah, great question. So I actually just recently did an audit of a whole industry. So I looked at influencer marketing agencies, because we were looking at maybe working with one. We're already working with a company that's kind of influencer adjacent. So I kind of wanted to understand what the market was doing and how people were talking and all that stuff. So what I did was I went and looked at probably 10 different influencer marketing agencies.
Okay.
And this is a problem that I think most people have, is I went on and I was like, okay, how are they talking about themselves? And I kid you not, for probably 95% of the companies I looked at, they all almost verbatim were saying the exact same thing. They were saying that they were the number one influencer marketing agency in the world, and they had it as the H1 on their website, like almost 100%. And I was
Wow.
so surprised. I knew that they were probably going to be pretty similar because it's a kind of a red ocean. Like there are a lot of different competitors. It's the fractured
Yeah.
market. But I was shocked at how similar they were talking about themselves. Because like if I'm coming in as a consumer and I'm an influencer and I want to be represented, I want a manager and I'm in the market for what you're selling, and I went and visited all of these 10, 15 different agency websites of these, big meat eating New York agencies. Based off the website, there's really no tangible reason why I should choose one over another. It's almost like I just got to flip a coin because they're
Hmm.
not communicating about what makes them different. Maybe they have a whole new process. And that's the thing too, is like they might very well be different. They probably are. They probably have different processes. They probably have different connections. They probably have different focuses. Maybe one agency is focused just on like athletes, influencer athletes, and maybe
Yeah.
another is focused on chefs and like cooking or something like that. But you wouldn't
Yeah.
know it because they all look the same and they all talk about themselves the same way. And so I would say one thing that you could do right now is if you are in a pretty crowded market, if it's, you win at the other's expense, I would take a look at, am I different? Like, am I noticeably different? Am I talking about myself in a way that clearly sets me apart in some way, shape, or form um, as a valuable competitor, as a valuable option in the marketplace? Because so many people don't. And if you were to do that, like it's low hanging fruit because people would see that you're different and you would be able to
Yeah.
prove that your value is a little bit more because of XYZ. And it's a quick win, low hanging fruit.
Yeah. And so you said adding some clarity, like if you're just going after athletes or whatever the silo is, right? You said it could be your process. But when you and I talked about my brand, you brought up something I thought was real compelling was the origin story. So do you use the origin story of these companies a lot of times to differentiate themselves from other companies? Or does
Yeah,
that
you
come in a different part of the process?
no, you certainly can, 100%. Let's go with I think Young Living might even be a good example of this. Young Living is an essential oil company. It's in Utah. Pretty big in the direct selling world. Kind of one of the OGs. Is
Hmm.
certainly the OG in like essential oils in that movement. Um, but like the founder story of like Gary Young like was very unique in that he kind of pioneered this process of like owning the farm and growing the crops himself and um, controlling the whole production process of essential oils from seed to seal is what he called it.
Yeah.
And that was like his contribution. That's why he started the company. And so you can certainly use your own origin story as a company to convey your uniqueness. If you as the founder kind of noticed that, oh, like there's an opportunity here that no one's doing, no one's capitalizing on this yet. It's unique, it's different.
Hmm.
Your story about how you developed that solution or how you kind of created this segment or process or product or whatever that's different is probably could be a really big tool in your arsenal. You have to be careful though because lots of companies fall victim to this mistake, which is they try to make themselves the hero of the story. They want to talk about themselves, their achievements, the accolades, the awards they've won. Oh, like we were voted Forbes best place to work in 2024, and
Yeah.
like those are fine, but like you have to remember that there's one hero in the story, and it's your customer. And so you always have to kind of check yourself to make sure that you are not talking about yourself as if you're the main character.
Yeah.
You're not the center of attention. You always kind of have to defer the spotlight to the people you're trying to help, your customers, right?
Hmm.
And so to answer your question shortly and succinctly, yes, your origin story can be really huge if you use it right. And then the way you use it right is you play the guide and you don't play the hero. You position your expertise, your origin story, um, your uniqueness as a tool that the hero can use to solve their problems. Don't ever make yourself sound like the bee's knees because you've done XYZ, because that's a turnoff. Because heroes aren't looking for other heroes. Heroes are looking for guides. Heroes are looking for someone to help them. And so if you talk about yourself like you're a hero, they're not going to, they're automatically not going to pay attention to you because they're not looking for you. They're looking for a guide. They're looking for someone that can help them.
I imagine that the bigger you get as a company, the more that origin story can get watered down to, right? So like the Young Living story is, well, we own our own farms and we have the best quality. Well, we saw at the time that we were there. We didn't mention this in the beginning, but Cameron and I both worked at Young Living for many years, and we saw from the time that I started, which was almost 10 years ago, there were not a lot of companies out there saying seed to seal and best quality, and we do our own farms. Now there are a lot. Now there's a lot that have proof, scientific proof that they have great quality and stuff, and so that origin story can almost get watered down, and you have to almost reinvent yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is kind of where messaging has to really be, or whoever's in charge of messaging at your organization should be in lockstep with senior leadership and maybe even product development, because to your point, like you do like if you want to stay competitive, you always have to be on your toes. Like you always have to kind of reinvent yourself in small ways over the course of the company's life, and because you do that, like your messaging will change depending on how you pivot and
Yeah.
updates and changes you make. So yeah, it's a great point. You'll have to kind of always have your thumb on the pulse of who are we as a company? Are we changing? If we are changing, does the messaging need to change? Does that need to be reflected? So
how do you balance creativity with clarity to ensure the brand messaging really resonates with your target audience?
yeah, great question. One of the things that Protagonist does is it's called Message Playbook, and we'll come into a company and we'll actually help you develop your unique 7 story brand messages that are tailored to your company, to your product, right? And this is a question I get asked a lot is um, we'll get done with the playbook and they'll be like, this is great, but I feel really, really like suffocated. Like I feel really confined by these 7 key messages. Because essentially what we say is, these 7 key messages are it. Like this is how we talk about ourselves. And at first glance, when you're starting to think within the context of the framework and you're trying to apply it in marketing copy and emails and websites, it can feel kind of like you're hogtied to like the specific words are in the specific order and we have to say it in this way. And I always tell people that that's not the case. The goal of Message Playbook and the StoryBrand framework is not to be so rigid that you can't be creative. In fact, there's a great T.S. Eliot quote that I love. He says, when essentially, I'll paraphrase because I don't know it verbatim, but he's essentially saying, if you just let your imagination wander, you're not going to produce really, really good results. But if you force yourself to work and think within a framework, your output will be so much better because that's where your imagination works. Is when you give yourself guidelines, when there's lanes in the bumper, when there's bumpers in the bowling lane, that's when your imagination and creativity kind of kick in, and you're like, okay, given these constraints or given these rules, how can I be creative? How can I still say this? And so another thing I tell people is, you have 7 different key messages, but inside those inside those 7 key messages, there's like 4,000 different combinations of the key messages, pairing, hero language with stakes language and stakes language with plan language. Like there's so many different ways you can orchestrate your key message in really, really creative, interesting ways while still being on message, while still staying focused on this is how we talk about ourselves. This is how we stay clear. This is how we stay consistent.
I can see that being a challenge, especially if you have some more creatives on the team helping do the brand messaging with you. And I can see, especially the bigger you get, there are more people who want to voice their opinion on how that message should be. And so finding that balance between like staying in those 7 steps or those 7 principles, as opposed to being creative and trying to like find your own voice, I can see that could be a bit challenging.
Yeah, it is, especially when you're first starting. This is something I learned from Donald Miller. He always says, when you're first starting out, when I went through the training, when I was learning how to like, use the framework not only for myself, but also, take people through it. He was always saying, think of it like learning to play the guitar, like you're learning to play music. As you start to strum, you're learning different notes and where your finger should go, and all that stuff. You start to understand, and you start to get an ear for which chords sound well together, and and as you do that, you're able to play more proficiently. And so thinking about the 7 key messages as notes or as chords on a guitar, the more you practice, the more you kind of get an ear for, oh, like hero language really sounds good with guide language, or problem language sounds really, really good with stakes language. It just comes with, putting the reps in. You got to get
Yeah.
practice and all that stuff. But it is challenging, especially if you haven't thought of it before. If this is a new way of thinking for you, then it can be challenging. But it can be done. I've watched it be done at big organizations. You can execute on it, and when you do, it's phenomenal. Like it just sings. Everything sings.
So, okay, so on that note, with SEO or paid ads or email, there it's easy to look at Google Analytics and be like, "Hey, SEO is working, paid ads is working." Like, tell me, like, how do you measure the effectiveness of like brand messaging? Is there a specific tool you can look at, or is it just higher conversion across all of those channels? Like, how do you know if it's working or not?
So after playbook's been executed, and we're now in like execution and application mode. One of
Mhm.
the things that we'll look at is, okay, let's have a 3 and a 6 week follow up, and as we're looking at rolling this out and we're kind of releasing the message into the wild, um, can we get some customer feedback? Can we have a focus group? Can we have a survey? Can we test this? In addition to looking at our conversion rates higher, our engagement rates higher, where are people falling off, and kind of creating like a systematic structure of, for example, for like social media or something like that, you could say, we're going to run a campaign that's pretty much entirely based on problem language. And so you can test problem language. You can test your problem language and focus on that and run A/B tests with that. And then you can start to kind of methodically work your way through the framework, maybe even test key messages that go together, and just kind of gauge as you go. But this is something I also tell people, which is that, your message playbook isn't static. Just because we did all this work and we have these 7 key messages, like it doesn't mean that this is the way it's going to be until either you die or the company dies. Um,
Yeah.
you'll always learn a lot from letting it out into the wild and seeing how it behaves.
Well, not to mention just how fast digital changes. Like 10 years ago, half the social media accounts that are here didn't exist before, that are social media platforms, right? And so who knows what's going to be next and how you're going to have to adapt. Walk me through, like, right now, with there's like 10 different social media platforms. Most companies are on like 3 to 5 of them. So between their website, their blog, their YouTube, and all of these social media accounts, how do we manage the message across all of those? Is it only needed in one? Is it needed in all of them? Like, walk me through that.
This is a really great question, and this is also a challenge or not a challenge, but this is like a hurdle that lots of people have to get over, is consistency. Um, another one of my favorite StoryBrand mantras is, marketing is an exercise in memorization, right? So you should be saying the same thing over and over again on all of your channels, whether it's your blog, your website, your nurture sequences and email. Like, you should be saying the same thing everywhere, so that no matter where someone gets introduced to you or someone's listening to you, it's the same thing everywhere. Because ultimately, like, the reason you should care about messaging, or one of the reasons, is you want to be known for something. You want to be known for solving a problem. You want to own a problem. You want to own a specific segment of your market, and the way you do that is just constantly saying the same thing over and over and over again. And so, one of the ways that you can ensure consistency is, it kind of depends on, I think you mentioned this earlier, it kind of depends on the framework of the company. What's the structure like? Do you have copywriters flung through the 4 corners of the company, like
Yeah.
in APAC and in EMEA, and like, do you have the American market, or however you're segmented up? that could be a real big challenge because you kind of have to bring everyone in and talk about, train them. Like, this is how you use this. This is what this is. That could be difficult. But if you are a smaller operation and you're not burdened by headcount and you're a little bit leaner and you can run faster and not ask for permission as much, it's a little easier because there's less hands in the kitchen. Um, and if that is your case, constantly referencing message playbook, constantly referencing your 7 key messages, and asking yourself, how can we build a social media campaign out of problem and hero language? How can we incorporate hero language into the H1 of our website? Essentially, the StoryBrand framework becomes a filter through which all of your marketing communications should first pass through.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the litmus test. Like, if it isn't on message, it doesn't go out. If it's not based off of one of the key messages, it shouldn't be said. Which sounds really, really restrictive, as we talked about earlier. But again, with inside that, there's so many different ways you can be creative and still be on message. One of the ways because we ran into this too when we were training people on message playbook after we were done, we saw that, the end deliverable was a PDF, and then we trained them on how to use it. But ultimately, over a period of a few months, everyone would regress to the mean, and they'd kind of go back to what they knew before, and they weren't getting much ROI out of it. So one of the things we've done is to your earlier question, what's a project that I'm working on right now that excites me? One of the things we've done is we've taken OpenAI's ChatGPT, and we've created a custom backend version of Message Playbook that we train ChatGPT on. So one of the end deliverables of Message Playbook is, hey, here's this ChatGPT bot that's specifically and uniquely trained on your key messages. Mm-hmm. And you can interact with it, and it spits out on message copy, on message ideas, like 99% of the time. And so it's a little bit easier than having just reference a PDF. You can actually ask it questions like, what's my problem language? And it gives you an answer. You're like, okay, can you use that in an email subject line? Or, hey, the execs asked me to make a presentation on our customer research. Can you incorporate our hero language into that? And all that stuff. So that makes it a little easier. But I'd say, from a tactical perspective, just constantly make sure that when you're writing copy, when you're planning your content, make sure it all comes from those 7 key messages. Make sure that you're referencing those, and it's not an afterthought. You're not tacking on good messaging onto the content after the fact, but make sure that everything is kind of born from those 7 key messages. And if you look at it from that perspective, if that's the way you're producing and running production, you'll have a really good fighting chance of making it stick.
Is that the same no matter what type of business model you have? So if you're a B2B or a D2C or, a SaaS company, is it the same across the board, or are there tweaks you have to make within each one?
The beauty about the StoryBrand framework and Message Playbook is, whatever your style, whatever your model is, if you're B2B or whatever, it stays the same. What does differ are the tactics that you use to deploy the message. So, for example, for D2C, for e-commerce and all that stuff, you'd probably be running some version of a traditional funnel where you're worried about awareness up top and conversion and leads in the middle and all that stuff. Those tactics are unique probably to D2C. They're not going to work really well for B2B. But the Message Playbook, StoryBrand, works perfectly with that model. And it would work really, really well with B2B as well. So it just kind of depends on, it's a matter of, how can I apply the StoryBrand framework to my chosen acquisition channel and model? And, what kind of content do I need to create? For B2B, you might be more in-person meetings. Can I have a sales script or talking points based off of the messaging? The tactics vary, but the broad strategy inside the StoryBrand framework is usually universal in its application.
Are there any other pieces of advice that you would offer up to these business owners or up and coming marketers that maybe I forgot to ask about?
The one thing I would say is, in my experience, like working with companies and founders and of companies of all sizes, people like the idea of consistent messaging more than they like consistent messaging. And that's just because I think it's hard, like you brought it up earlier, it's hard to stay consistent and disciplined once you have the key messages. And so I'd say that the difference between, if you're going to read the book and you're going to kind of try to figure this out, what are my 7 key messages? If you're going to do the work and put all of that time and energy into distilling who you are in those 7 key messages, um, I want you to get like a good ROI out of that. And obviously you do as well. And so the one thing I would say is, if you're to that point, you've read the book, you've got what you think are the key messages, I'd say stay the course, make sure you're disciplined, discipline yourself, discipline your team, because it's only after constant repetition that people start to understand who you are. Because I can't remember what it is, but it's some stat that it's like it takes someone, the average person, 15 times or 10 times or something to fully internalize an idea. And so a lot of people will like roll out the playbook and they're like a month or two later, they're like, oh, it's not working. It's like, well, you haven't told enough people enough times yet. Like you have to
Yeah.
really stick with it. This is like a long-term investment. You have to really invest time and discipline. So I would say that stay the course. If you have these key messages, stay the course, pivot where you learn, because you'll see, oh, my problem language isn't really landing, but I did hear from a customer review that this might be the problem. So I'm gonna swap these two concepts out. Like you can pivot like that, but like stay working inside the framework, and you probably
Yeah.
won't go wrong. There's a high percentage that you're gonna kill it.
Nice. Remind me the name of the book again.
The book is called Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller. You can find it on Amazon. Um, Such a great investment. If this resonated with you, I'd say definitely go buy the book. Don, I mean, he wrote the book, so he's going to have so much more information than we talked about here.
Any other books or podcasts or YouTube channels that people would want to follow to learn about the same messaging?
That's key. Definitely read that one. Start there. If you are hungry for more, you can get into. You start reading other books. You can get into. This is where you start getting into like the theory of screenwriting and storytelling and writing and all that stuff. Same principles apply, but like don't get freaked out like by the fact that like this book is for writers and authors and screenwriters and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Another good one is called Story by Robert McKee. It's the style and substance of screenwriting. So that's Story by Robert McKee. If you're into masterclass, if you have like that subscription, there's a really great course by Aaron Sorkin. He's a national treasure. Wrote A Few Good Men, wrote The Social Network, wrote Moneyball, The West Wing. Dude's a prolific, fantastic storyteller. He has a great course on masterclass about screenwriting that talks about so
Nice.
many of these archetypal things that are mentioned in StoryBrand about like intention and obstacle. So he calls hero language and problem language. He calls them intention and obstacle. But he talks about how you need to have an intention and you need to have an obstacle.
Yeah.
Hero language and problem language. So you'll start to see in these books and in these courses, this is like universal stuff. All you're doing is you're just borrowing it from entertainment and using it to, be unfairly competitive in your marketing.
Cameron, how can people get in touch with you if they want to?
You can follow me on LinkedIn. I don't know if people follow people on LinkedIn, but I'm on LinkedIn. You can follow me. You can see me there. My last name's Olds, Olds, Cameron Olds. You can also go to Protagonist's website, Protagonist Comms with 2 M's, COMMS, protagonistcomms.co. If you listened and you're like, oh, this is great, maybe you're familiar with StoryBrand, but you've read the book and you're like, oh, I don't know if I can quite get it myself. Get in contact with me. I can do a message audit for you, which is what you and I did.
Yep.
Once upon a time. It's 100% free. What I do is I audit. I pull 50 different pieces of content from social media, your website, maybe even email sometimes, pull 50 different pieces of content, and I use the StoryBrand framework to give each piece of content a grade, a good, better, or best grade. And at the end, you kind of get like a comprehensive grade of like, oh, your hero language is really, really good, but your plan languages could use some work. Here's some tips.
Yeah.
So you can order a message audit there, 100% free. Comes with a free Q&A call with me after. 100% free. I'm not going to sell you anything. It's 100% for you, just to kind of dip your toe in and get an idea of where your strengths and weaknesses are, as well as some actionable things you can do to improve your messaging on your own.
Yeah, and I did it. Cameron pulled out a bunch of good stuff for me, and I appreciate you doing that. It's really helped shape our brand messaging, and I still have a lot to do to get to where I need to be based on all of your advice. But man, what a wealth of knowledge! I really appreciate you taking the time to jump on today and teach us. I think that if people really take this to heart, I think that they'll be able to really transform how people see them compared to their competitors and become really strong, loyal customers long term.
100%. That's the end goal. You said it better than I could. Absolutely.
Well, thanks again for taking the time, Cameron. I appreciate it. And for everyone who's listening, we'll talk to you guys next week. Thanks so much for listening to the episode today. Listen, I know how valuable an hour of your time can be, and for you to take that busy time out of your day and spend it with us, it really means a lot. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider liking and subscribing on whatever platform you're on. And don't forget to leave a comment. Tell us what you thought about the interview. Ask us questions. Let us know what other digital topics you'd like to hear about in the future. We're here to add value to your life and elevate your digital presence online. If you'd like some help doing that, reach out to me at fireusmarketing.com. See you on the next one.